The following video contains discussions of sexual assault, trafficking, and violence. If you or someone you know is in a time of crisis, links to resources are in the description below. In October of 1990, a scandal at Brown University raised tensions amongst the student body and made headlines as a PR nightmare. Several female students, feeling that the administration had not sufficiently dealt with their reports of sexual assault, began writing names on the walls of the women's restroom inside the campus library. These names formed a list of male students whom anonymous contributors had alleged of sexual assault. As the list grew, janitorial staff scrambled to remove it, only for the names to reappear in a matter of days. Eventually, lists were being made in other campus restrooms, and administrative staff were forced to hold a student forum, which would eventually lead to changes in Brown's policies towards sexual offenses. Whether you morally agree with what Brown spokesman Robert Reichley referred to as magic marker terrorists, ostensibly this was a group of traumatized people communing in the hopes of protecting one another. And this scandal did precipitate reforms. Administrative staff were forced to listen to the stories of students who felt that they had been treated insensitively, and male students began reaching out to women's centers and attending seminars informing them on date rape. But something to keep in mind here is that this all occurred before the internet existed as we know it today. It could even be argued that the whole reason this story gained traction in the first place was because a student decided to write an editorial about it in the Brown Daily Herald. While it might not seem significant to people who have grown up on social media, the average person now has more outlets for public speaking than ever before. People in marginalized groups can now form communities online without being impeded by distance. And for the most part, this is great. People can collectively share knowledge that benefits the in-group while promoting understanding from the out-group. So, what happens when your community is taken away? What does a vulnerable group of people do when they've been deplatformed? Let's talk about FOSTA SESTA. In the spring of 2017, Congresswoman Ann Wagner, a conservative Republican from Missouri, introduced the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, abbreviated FOSTA, which included the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, SESTA. The act serves as an addendum to Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1934, wherein Section 230 states that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. The introduction of FOSTA adds that Section 230 will not be construed to impair or limit civil action or criminal prosecution against those accused of facilitating or promoting prostitution in jurisdictions where it is illegal. All right, so that was the technical rundown, but I'm a dum-dum who used their degree to make no-no videos. So let's layman it up, shall we? To start, FOSTA is in service of federal law, whereas SESTA is at the state level. I'm about to read this part directly from my notes because I am just too verbose. Prior to their introduction, Section 230 of the Communications Act protected websites that hosted user-generated content from legal ramifications if the user published something illegal on the site, so long as the host website was unaware. FOSTA SESTA creates a loophole specifically with regards to sex work. By using the word facilitate, FOSTA implies that social media websites themselves could be found liable if illegal sex work is advertised by users. Prior to their introduction, Section 230 of the Communications Act protected websites that hosted user-generated content from legal ramifications if a user posted something illegal to the website, as long as the host site wasn't aware of it. FOSTA SESTA creates a loophole specifically with regards to sex work. And by using the word facilitate within the law, it implies that social media websites can be found legally liable if their users are advertising illegal sex work on the site. Now, as you can imagine, this prompted many websites to take a more proactive stance in stamping out those damn dirty whores. From the outset, FOSTA was framed as a move against trafficking. Websites and platforms alike would now have to answer for children being bought and sold on their platforms like Wayfair cabinet children. And obviously, I'm not in support of sex trafficking. Why, of course I want to allow victims to fight online sex trafficking. But is that the sweeping change that this bill brought about? Well, it was certainly written with good intentions. And we all know where those lead. Hello, my very esteemed guests. I will be your tour guide on this delightful descent. Virgil. Today, I am going to be taking you through the sinful circle of lustful lawbreakers. Allow me to give you the rundown of some of our historic attractions. Online sex work can be said to have begun in the late 90s or early aughts with the launch of the free listings website Craigslist. Soon after, other sites would pop up with more deliberate intent of encouraging sexual commerce. The behemoth most often cited was Backpage.com, but other sites such as Eros and Cowboys for Angels also advertised escort services. Many sex workers claim that these websites made their work safer, as it allowed them time to interact with a client from a distance. Through messages and negotiations, a worker could get a feel for the temperament of the client and decide if they wanted to go through with the exchange. Some websites and user-generated forums also shared blacklists. In a manner akin to the Brown University rape walls, these lists would describe physical features, mannerisms, localities, and possible pseudonyms of Johns who were either violent or insolvent. That being said, it wasn't a paradise. With some creative wording, traffickers were able to advertise victims, often minors, who were available at their discretion. As sex workers avoided the prying eyes of the law, so did pimps and traffickers, unfortunately. Melanie Thompson, a trafficking survivor who now works with the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, had personal experience with Backpage. In support of FOSTA SESTA, she has given interviews recounting how, after she was kidnapped at the age of 12, her abuser would create ads on Backpage in order to prostitute her. That being said, there is some evidence to suggest that the existence of these sexual commerce sites was a net positive. While doing research for this video, one study in particular kept popping up again and again. A 2019 Baylor University study which posits that Craigslist erotic services section reduced the rate of female homicides in cities where it was available. And it's pretty obvious why sex worker-friendly articles love to cite this one. The study found that in some cities, when the erotic services section was introduced, the amount of homicides against women who were unfamiliar with their attackers went down as much as 17.6%. And I would love nothing more than to tell you that this study is as much of a slam dunk as it sounds like it is. But I am not in hell for any moral reasons. It turns out Sky Daddy just doesn't like anyone who came before his son's very public T-posing, so I guess I am stuck here. Alright, so I have some problems with this study. Obviously, you can never draw any concrete conclusions from a single study. Results have to be replicated, reviewed, and overdone more than a meme 2 hours after Twitter gets a hold of it. Even so, the authors of this study ran into the same problem that I have as I've been researching this topic. There is no census of sex workers in the United States. Studies on prostitution that I've come across make no effort whatsoever to delineate between trafficking victims and sex workers, if they even bothered to count sex workers at all. As a poet, I'm a stickler for language, so I would like to establish something right here. A sex worker is not the same as a trafficking victim. A sex worker is a willing adult professional, and a sex trafficking victim is a victim. Even if you disagree morally with the practice, what do we gain critically from conflating the two? Beyond just demonizing sex workers, public academia seems reluctant to even acknowledge that sex workers can exist in an autonomous capacity. So whenever someone actually tries to do a study on sex workers, they have to draw a bunch of roundabout conclusions from user-edited public data, which is very difficult to verify. And for the sake of ease, they often have to completely ignore the existence of male sex workers. The study makes pains to detail how it came up with its figures, primarily screening users of the Erotic Review, a website for clients to review their experiences with specific sex workers, as well as searching for specific terms in reviews that would denote whether the encounter was initiated online or on a street. These figures were then compared with female non-acquaintance homicide rates in the workers' areas and a timeline of Craigslist's erotic service section. If anything, this study makes a strong argument for the necessity of sex worker representative surveys. While its findings suggest a potential good that can come from allowing workers to access these online services, it is impossible to draw a definitive conclusion in favor of or against online sexual commerce until the user base is properly accounted for. Regardless, once FOSTA SESTA passed, Backpage was shut down, and plenty of changes to the internet followed suit. If you ever wondered why Tumblr switched to forbidding explicit content, this was the reason. Fear of litigation led some sites to start blindly shooting down non-explicit sexual education content, and media featuring LGBTQ topics was increasingly censored. Oh, and the furry dating website pounce.org voluntarily shut down. Part 2. The View from the Street. So, while this was all going on, I actually had access to some forums used by FSSW to confide in each other. A bit of a vocabulary lesson here. FSSW stands for Full Service Sex Worker. It's typically used to refer to any worker who engages in intercourse with their client, but I've also seen it used sometimes to refer to performers in adult films. The distinction between FSSW and other sex workers is made because within the world of sex workers, there exists this thing called the hierarchy. Stop me if you've heard this before. I could never be a whore, but I wouldn't mind being one of those high-class call girls. Yeah, I used to do some stripping back in the day, but don't worry, I never did anything with a client. I'm not that kind of girl. I only sell lewds on my OnlyFans. I don't have to be naked to make money. Cool, 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 cool. That's cool, cool, cool. Good for you, good for you. I'm so happy for you. Because sex work is often morally stigmatized, a defense mechanism that a lot of workers have employed is to point the finger at other workers who they've arbitrarily decided are doing something worse. Even amongst FSSW, there is a tendency to look down upon workers who are doing so out of necessity, workers who are addicts, and workers who solicit on the streets. It's also worth noting that the lines of these hierarchies, as with many other things, tend to favor people who are white, cis, and able-bodied, myself included. Okay, vocabulary lesson over. So, I was in these online spaces at the time, and I'm familiar with all the relevant info. So, for legal purposes, I would like to say, in the words of one of our esteemed guests, James Charles, I am a virgin. So, if I imply that I did any illicit activities for cash, well, assume that I'm lying. Does this hurt my credibility? This is a YouTube video, friends. You should be checking my sources anyways. You're welcome to take anything I say here with a grain of salt, but I'd like to share with you what I think is a pretty relevant personal anecdote. Around 2016, I was active in several public online forums where LGBTQ people would discuss their struggles with online dating. A very common response whenever someone would post about encountering someone with bizarre proclivities was, "Why don't people just hire a sex worker?" This was a space I felt comfortable in, so I usually ran my big mouth and would respond with something along the lines of, "Hey, sex workers don't exist to take the brunt of other people's concerning behaviors. Maybe rethink this." After a while, I started receiving multiple private messages from my peers, and we would just chat about what our job was like, what was going on in our lives, what our plans were for the future, and these people very quickly became some of my closest friends. I then received a private message saying that if I was willing to go through a screening and vetting process, I would be invited into a private forum for people in my line of work. The next week I was in. This is going to sound very pathetic, but for the time I was in that forum, I was actually really excited to be on the internet. I would check notifications as soon as they came in. I was constantly thinking about things I could share with my peers, and on really hard days, I would go through the forum posts and I saw so much stuff that I could relate to that for the first time in what was a very long time for me at that point in my life, I felt a lot of hope. It's somewhat hard to imagine nowadays with celebrities on OnlyFans and your cousin openly selling feet pics on Facebook, but even in 2016, this was still a line of work where people with complicated histories could find community and support within another. It sounds pretty damning for a profession to be something that damaged people flock towards, but nobody does it to be popular or accepted. It's still a job. It's something that we do to survive in our circumstances. And while I think it's great that the stigma against sex workers has lessened over the years, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't a little sad that I can't as easily identify people who are like me. When I got hired at a professional studio, one of the girls I was working with asked me how I came to be in this line of work. And I had grown so accustomed to people in this line of work being like me that I just fully recounted to her the harrowing tale of how I ended up taking my clothes off for money. And she just looks at me with these eyes wide with terror, and she says, "Oh, I go to the nearby college. I just wanted something that could fit in with my class schedule." Honey girl, I am so happy for you. Everyone in that studio was a straight white girl, or looked like one. I had to take a break from filming, and by the time I was able to come back, the sun had already set, so it's a new day, and I am still Virgil. Do you like that I labeled this section as Chicago? Because, like, Chicago's the windy city, and this layer of hell is supposed to have, like, constant winds. I just want you to appreciate that. By the way, I ate the apple and the pomegranate. So, yeah, just pretend the symbolism, the mise-en-scène, that little piece is still there, and we'll get through this, okay? So, before FOSTA SESTA really gathered speed, the forum was just a place for people to talk about their day, ask for advice, rant about clients, etc., etc. But as the bill gathered speed, there was a notable shift in tone. People started making posts expressing concern about their futures, about their job security. And when the bill passed and Backpage went down, people started posting about the things they were going to need to do to survive moving forward. Friends of mine went back to their pimps for security, and people started posting information of family members to contact if they went silent. People without reliable access to food and shelter were talking about having to return to the streets. That's when the missing person post started. This was an online forum, so its users were mostly spread out across the country, but a few of them were actually friends in real life. As workers were being pushed back onto the streets, posts began popping up on the forum informing everybody that active members had gone out to work and hadn't been heard from since. And I don't know what happened to any of those missing people, because not long after that, the forum was taken down. I don't know if the forum was taken down voluntarily or not, but regardless, I see this as just another safe space that was taken away from people who needed it. And I have trouble seeing the good in that. Part 3. Damned if you do. I want to go back to Melanie Thompson. And I want to preface this by saying that I have nothing but love and respect for her as an activist. She works as the youth outreach coordinator for a global organization working to end the trafficking of women. It's important to remember that the context in which I'm speaking about sex work is very Eurocentric. Her work has enabled policy change, and from what I can see, she seems genuinely invested in helping women escape terrible situations. In an interview with Now This, she describes a sense of personal satisfaction that Backpage, a website that was used to traffic her, has been taken down.
It's definitely a victory on a personal level. I'm so happy that the website that exploited me for all of these years is now eradicated.
And I'm thankful she could feel that. I hope everyone who's experienced something like this can find peace in their own way. I didn't have the same exact experience Melanie did. When I talk about sex work, I'm talking about things that I did as a consenting adult. And while I can unfortunately empathize with some of her childhood experiences, and I'm a survivor myself, I compartmentalize these things differently. Ultimately, Melanie and I want many of the same things, and where we disagree is on how to get there. In that Now This interview, Melanie explains that she supports partial decrim.
One of the things that I advocate for is partial decrim, or partial decriminalization of prostitution. Decriminalizing the person that's engaging in prostitution, or in their words, the sex worker, right? And criminalizing those who perpetrate it, so the sex buyers and the pimps or the traffickers.
Fundamentally, we both believe there shouldn't be legal repercussions for the worker or victim. Where we differ is that she is still in favor of prosecuting the Johns, i.e., people who buy sex. And you know what? That's fine. In leftist circles, there is a tendency to adopt a very all-or-nothing attitude towards policy change, as if any incremental progress will sabotage our end goals. What I'm trying to argue here is that FOSTA SESTA was explicitly a step in the wrong direction, not that all incremental change is bad. While we can argue incessantly about is it moral to buy and sell sex, workers and victims alike are being punished. And for what? Why? The best case scenario there is that we're denying people their own bodily autonomy. And the worst case is that we're literally punishing victims. And yeah, we're literally punishing victims. According to a 2015 submission to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review of the United States, an unfortunate consequence of focusing on maximizing arrests and prosecutions without adequate allocation of resources to identify victims and safeguard their rights is that victims of human trafficking frequently first come into contact with the criminal justice system because they are arrested. The submission was made by the International Women's Human Rights Clinic and the CUNY Law School Trafficking Victims Advocacy Project, abbreviated TVAP. TVAP provides legal advocacy and representation for trafficking victims who are facing prosecution. They also provide resources to victims who have already faced criminalization and are looking to move on. Through their work, they've created a report detailing how the American legal system often fails to identify victims of trafficking and make suggestions on how to improve legislation in this area. The way our legal system treats victims is lacking, and according to Shared Hope International, as of 2019, 20 states in the US still allow for minors to be charged with prostitution. Geez, the law is not the arbiter of morality, but at least if I get arrested for selling 7 minutes in heaven with this hellish harlot, I'm an adult. That's my choice. That's on me. But I cannot imagine a situation in which a child participating in sexual commerce is anything but a victim. Part 4. Closing thoughts. So, what brings you down here? Why have I decided to dredge up all of this unsavory information on our seedy underbelly? Well, mainly it's because I don't want FOSTA SESTA to become an acceptable norm in our society. I'm confident in saying that whether you realize it or not, many of you have been affected by these laws in the past few years. For most of you, that probably just meant your favorite naughty video was taken down, or you can't see as many titties on social media anymore. It seems like we're incrementally stepping closer and closer to an all-ad-friendly internet, and for the many of you who I know have made friends on here, that could be pretty scary. I already lost my community, and I've been out of those spaces for a few years now. But workers are still facing these struggles today. And I want to emphasize that ultimately, this did not impact me in the same way it impacted my peers. I was fine. I'm, at the end of the day, a middle-class white person. I had other things going for me and other places I could turn to. So, if it was still so devastating for me to lose a safe place to talk about my life and my experiences, imagine how it impacted someone who was worse off. It's insidious in a way. Historically, you can't stop sex work from happening, so You make it as dangerous as possible for the workers and hope that takes care of the problem. And it doesn't stop with FSSW either. As I was doing research for this video, OnlyFans announced plans to remove their more explicit content. And then, as I was still writing this, after receiving massive amounts of backlash from some of their highest earners, they announced they had redacted their decision. As sex workers enter the mainstream, the fight to keep us down is only going to get stronger. It is important now more than ever that we continue to speak up against the ways in which we're being silenced. I'm Cameron Action. Thank you for watching.